live. I'm so happy to be here. Hopefully you're also joining us for either lunch or coffee, depending on where you are in the country. But just excited to have Krister Ungerböck with me. So we're going to have a great topic talking about how to get yourself heard. And he's going to tell us a little bit about his book and, who he is. But if you're joining us, tell us where you're joining from. I'd love to see all of the people visiting from all the different places across the globe. So would love to see where you are. So in the meantime, Krister, why don't you tell us about yourself for everyone who doesn't know who you are and your amazing book.
So my name is Krister Ungerböck, and I was formerly a CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world. And almost to the day, 5 years ago, I walked out on the CEO job of the company that I'd helped build and loved. We'd grown the company to over $100 million in shareholder value during my tenure as CEO of the company. And I walked out because I had some conflict with my shareholders that after working for 10, 15 years to try to resolve that conflict, I walked out on the company that I'd helped build and loved. And then 2 weeks later, my wife walked out on me. And so there I actually found myself at the YMCA signing up for a gym membership. And the woman asked me, "Who's your emergency contact?" And I broke down crying because in that moment, I realized I had no one. And here I was thinking I was a leader of a global company. But in that moment, I looked in the mirror and saw the leader I'd become. I was a leader with no followers. And it set me on a journey trying to find, what had I missed? I started reading business books when I was 12 years old because I wanted to make my dad proud. He was an entrepreneur. And I'd read hundreds, if not thousands, of business books by the time I hit age 42 and retired as CEO of that company. And I realized that there were some really important things that I hadn't learned. And so I went on a journey, surrounded myself with a lot of people that I used to describe as far out and weird back when I was CEO. Today I just call them people from California. And that was there where I discovered the key insights that I ultimately put in this book that I've been working on for 5 years.
Yeah. So, well, that's a really just amazing story. I can't imagine what that was like being in that YMCA and just realizing she didn't have anyone. That's just heartbreaking to me. So I'm sorry that happened, but can certainly appreciate your journey. One of the things I loved when I looked at your LinkedIn was your changing the words of the world. I thought that was super interesting. So touch on that for a second. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, so I started out and I wanted to write a book and give insights that would help people to give language that they could use both in leadership in the context of a family as well as leadership in teams and in business. And I had the unique experience of having to learn to lead as an adult in French and German when I moved to open businesses in Europe. And so language and words have always been very present kind of in my mind, certainly in the last 20 years since I started learning foreign languages. And a big part of what I was trying to do is, the interesting thing is I didn't really change my English words because that's my native language. Our native language is typically habitual. And until I really started writing this book in the last 5 years, I started looking at, wow, I always believed that my heart was in the right place as a leader. And admittedly, that's probably why people chose to follow, because they could see beyond my words, but they saw that my heart was in the right place, but unfortunately my words were not. And so a lot of the people would kind of say, oh, you need to change from the inside out. And then if you change what's on the inside, then the new words will just naturally fall out. But how does somebody judge us if, like, our words are what affect people, right? Mm-hmm. So I can change on the inside, but if I still use aggressive language because it's just a habit, then it's not going to change how people necessarily perceive me. So I actually took the reverse approach of saying, well, what if we just change our words? And what I found in my own life with my own children, with my former wife, who I have a good relationship with, also with my business partners, who I now also have a good relationship with, I saw that it was really much more about just changing our words. And so what if it was just that simple? If we start using new words with other people, then it'll start to change our relationships. And what I found is, even with my own experiences, that using new words started to change me from the outside in. And so my mission has really evolved to really changing the words of the world. And, this book has really caught fire in ways that I'd hoped, but it was kind of like, as a CEO, I always talk about the difference between vision and delusion. So I was kind of like, it's maybe this could be a big bestseller, as any author would hope. I had a bit of a plan to back it up, but I had no idea that it would kind of start to catch on as it has. And today I think the vision is really, when we even spoke last week, today the book is in the top 5 in motherhood, fatherhood, business teams, sociology of marriage and family, communication and management. So it's really that cross-category book that I really intended to write. And I've been fortunate to have some of the best editors and writing coaches kind of to walk with me along the way to make it happen. I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah, no, and it's such an interesting journey. We finally have some comments here. I was starting to worry that we weren't actually live because I typically have so many comments coming in, and I'm like, okay, maybe they're just all absorbing you. So Julie, thank you so much for sending a comment. Self-proclaimed word nerd over here, which she is, and I totally appreciate that about her. So I'm glad we are actually live because nobody shared their locations with me, which is odd. So I'm not sure if that first part actually displayed, but hopefully people have caught that story about the YMCA and that experience. So, we talked last week about, how this is Women's History Month and how International Women's Day was yesterday, and that one of the struggles that women have, or all employees have really, is getting their voice heard. And so you told me that you had some tools for that. And so would love to hear about that.
Yeah. So there's one of the chapters that gets the most feedback from, actually, I was just on a phone call yesterday and a woman said the same thing. I love the chapter 5. And the intention behind it was, I said that talk shifts, this is a great example of how talk shifts give words to those seeking their voice and courage to those seeking their volume. And so it's a technique called on a scale of 1 to 10, but it's a little bit adapted from what maybe some.
Krister, you froze up there on me. Hopefully it's temporary. So let's see. As we're waiting to see if he comes back, if anyone has any questions from the audience, please go ahead and shoot them our way. I'm really eager to hear what Krister has to say about just what tools can be used to really create that, either that bravery or to make sure that you have what you need to be successful. So. Oh, Krister's going to come back. So tell the YMCA story. So Krister was a CEO of a large tech company and not really aligned with his shareholders. And what happened was he decided that he needed to move on. But at the same time, he was actually going through splitting up with his spouse. And so he found himself in a YMCA. And he was just, signing up for a membership, and he needed to have an emergency contact. And so as he's filling out this form, he realizes that he doesn't have anyone. And the fact that he doesn't have anyone just basically breaks him down into tears. So even though, he'd been, reading leadership books and learning more about his communication skills and just growing as a person, he realized that in that moment, while he was all alone, that he really needed to develop that. And so he went on a journey and he started writing the book, but he also wanted to learn about and really grow. I got Krister on the phone. Hold on. Hey. Oh. Do you want to try from your phone? Yeah, just hit the link on your phone and maybe you can come back. I was just telling the audience the story about the YMCA. Okay, bye. All right. So construction people cut his internet just at the most awful time. So Krister will be trying to rejoin us from his phone. But what I found really interesting about the story. Oh,
all right,
Krister.
This is going to be
Hello.
interesting. I'm going to be holding the phone here. Oh man. So I have construction going on in my home, and I think that they just cut the internet. I'm on a wired connection and everything, so this is going to be very tiring to hold this phone up like this.
Well, I normally just set it up on something and kind of.
Well, let's just keep going.
Stack of books. Okay, all right. So you were telling us about the tools to get your voice heard, which I'm really eager to hear about.
Hold on. We're back.
Ooh.
All right, am I back?
You are. You're back.
All right, I really
okay.
I have not had I'm a tech guy. I haven't had an internet problem in like that during an interview ever. So first time for everything.
Hey, this happened. This is the first time this has ever happened to me too. So where someone sort of just disappeared, and I'm like, there's a reason why I do these interviews with someone, right? I'm like, okay, what do I talk about?
So we were talking about the a scale of 1 to 10, and so where did it cut out?
You were just going into the scale of 1 to 10 on the tools to use.
So this is the one tool that people most frequently comment about, not only using it at work, but also with children. So I had what we do is in order to kind of give words to people who are seeking their voice, often people, my wife is one of these people. For her, the definition of direct is I was eating on Saturday night, and I thought she had made me this Brussels sprouts as like for me as an appetizer, and she didn't want any of it. And I was like eating the last Brussels sprout, and she goes, "Would you like any broccoli?" And I could see from the look on her face, I was like, "Well, you're not really asking me if I want any broccoli. You're actually asking me, are you going to share the Brussels sprouts?" And so the point is that some people, to be direct is very difficult. And their definition, like I had employees who would work for me and they would come in and they'd say, "Oh, I thought I told you, like I thought I was yelling." And I was like, "I didn't really even perceive that you were yelling at all." And so the scale of 1 to 10 tool is a way for anyone to calibrate and basically give words to people to increase their volume. So let's say if I'm a leader, I could say on a scale of 1 to 10, how is our communication? And what we're going to do is we're going to exaggerate the scale. So let's say on a 10 being I communicate better than anyone that you've ever worked with in your entire career. And 1, I communicate worse than anyone you've ever communicated with in your entire career. And so now even the most indirect people can come back and they can say 7 or 8 and it doesn't feel nearly as direct, right? So then the point is really in the follow-up question. Because what happens is people will say, "Well, I'm not a 10, I'm not a 9, I'm not an 8, I'm not a 7, I'm a 6, but I can't tell my boss that, so I'm going to tell him 7. But then we ask, "Well, what's the difference between a 7 and a 9 for you?" And what happens is people tend to have at the tip of their tongue, what are some of the specific behaviors that we can do? So we specifically ask it is, what can we start doing or stop doing that would be the difference between a 7 and a 9? And now we can start putting together really specific actions that we can take. And you can use this in communication. In communication, I had a woman, Ashley, who was an entrepreneur from Michigan, who read the book. She sent me an email. She's like, "I got to tell you, I got to jump on the phone." She's like, "I just did this with my 8-year-old. she was on Zoom and she said, my 8-year-old has been playing his iPad, and I work in, this is the early days when we were on Zoom in quarantine, and he's always playing his iPad so loud, and I'm having this distraction in my business calls. And she just walked up to me and she goes, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're as loud as a freight train and 1 being you're as quiet as a mouse, where are you right now? And she said he just looked at her and turned his iPad down, and he went to his 6-year-old sister and whispered in her ear, and she turned her iPad down. So it's an example of kind of one of the probably simplest talk shift tools that we can use to kind of change conversations.
Okay, that was a really interesting example. So how would a leader use it?
So I think one of the things that I find, so I use the scale of 1 to 10 in a lot of different situations. Leaders, for example, probably one of the biggest, like top 5 complaints about leaders is micromanagement, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the talk shifts can be used in reverse. But so if I'm a leader, the first step would be to kind of talk with my employees and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much autonomy do you think that I grant you in your job? And what happens, and I was one of those leaders, I knew I was a little bit of a micromanager, but when you start asking that question, often the last person to know that they're a micromanager is actually the leader. But we start having a conversation, and then so people start saying 6 or 5, like, oh, well, I had no idea. I would have thought that I would have thought you would have said 8. So what's the difference between a 5 and an 8 for you? And so we can use that. Now, the other thing is the reverse shifts is you can actually also use that with your boss and say, and this is one of the reasons why I created the talk shifts so that they can be used in reverse, because often the people who are willing to change or, they're the ones who are reading the book. But what about the people who aren't? How do we get them to change? So you could also start a conversation with your boss and say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much autonomy do you think that I have? And the boss says 8, I say 8, I say 5, and we can start to have a conversation. Another way to do that, if you are a leader, where if you're leading a team and then your boss is the micromanager, is first, let's make sure that we aren't just as bad as our bosses, right?
Yeah.
So imagine a situation where I start talking with all of the people on my team, asking on a scale of 1 to 10, how much autonomy do you think I'm giving you? And then I can go to my boss and say, hey, Jen, I've been having some really interesting conversations with my team. I've been asking them on a scale of 1 to 10, how much autonomy do they think that I give them? And oh, wow, was I surprised by the answer? And now, hopefully, that might lead us to a conversation where the boss would say, well, it's an interesting, well, how much autonomy do you think that I grant you? Well, it's an interesting that you ask. I have a couple thoughts that I'd like to share on that. So again, this is just one of the 22 talk shifts. It's certainly one of the top 5 that people often mention a lot, partly because it's the 5th one in the book. So people usually call me after they get to that point and mention how they're using it. Interestingly, it's almost always when people mention it to me, they say, I'm using it at work, but what it really works with is my teenagers or my kids.
Yeah. No, and it makes me consider some things with my kids because that negotiation thing is always it's constant. So Lydia here says, I would have a problem with anyone asking how much autonomy do I grant you, better how much autonomy do you believe you have?
Yeah,
that's an interesting way. Yeah, and I would agree. Grant you is definitely different than how much autonomy do you believe you have.
Yeah.
Definitely agree with that.
In the book, I give multiple examples in a lot of these, so there are different variations. So
yeah. So why don't you give us another example from we're talking about the ladies in sales that run into this problem. Can you give me another example that would be useful to them?
So my wife is actually in kind of sales and marketing. And so she often finds that I think that it can be useful. So sometimes when we're trying to kind of increase our voice or make sure that we're heard, and as a leader, I used to coach my employees, as I was very direct. And what I find is that the more direct one person is, then the less likely they're going to hear. unless
Mhm.
someone is direct with them. So I would have employees where they would come in and they would say, I had one employee who quit, and they said, well, I said, why did you quit? And they said, well, I told you, like, this things that was frustrating me. I was like, I didn't even hear, because she goes, I was like, my stomach was turning. I was so afraid. And because I'm kind of more on the direct side, and it takes a lot to kind of, for me to get rattled. Like I wasn't even close to like even hearing, how serious this concern was. And so this scale of 1 to 10 can also be used in reverse. Like, so if a boss or someone says something, maybe it's a yes, no question. Like, so how excited are you about are you excited about the project? Which yes, no questions usually are not overly helpful, right? Because there's no, or are you excited to, would you like to buy? Will you sign? Like, insert any sales question here. If it's a yes or no question, what's the likelihood that a customer is really going to say no, right? Unless, but you can say so we can flip that, and somebody asks me a yes or no question, and I could say, well, if you're asking me on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being, I'm ready to move forward right now, and 1, like, there's a lot of steps between me and signing a contract, then I'd say I'm like a 6. So we can use this same tool in a lot of different contexts, almost to just reframe questions that maybe aren't asked of us in a way that gives us voice.
That's definitely interesting, and that's something I'll have to consider. So, when thinking about women in sales, and they're running into challenges with, let me give you a specific example that I heard recently. So, someone was assigned a territory and found that their territory was not as fruitful as their male peers.
Okay.
And so when going to approach her leader, she asked for assistance in how to phrase it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And since you're the guy talking about how to communicate better, I was wondering, what were your thoughts on that?
So, I've had salespeople, I ran a pretty big company, so I've definitely been on the other side of that conversation of handing out a sales territory that someone was not excited about.
Mm-hmm.
And so usually the salesperson would come in and be like, oh, this territory is no good. And, it'd be kind of something along those lines. So I would reframe that. I think it'd be much more like, put the onus back on the sales manager or leader and say, so let's say there's someone who has a similar territory that's better. Bob, let's call that person. So how would you compare my territory to Bob's? What would you say is better and more attractive about my territory than Bob's? And so now we're basically, we're asking the person to help us to understand. And, so essentially imagine if I'm the leader and I can't come up with a really good reason about why this territory is better than Bob's, then now I'm starting to kind of see a little bit more of your perspective. And so, in what ways is the territory less attractive? What are the challenges in this territory? What are the biggest obstacles? How do those obstacles compare to others? And so now we're basically leading the leader with our questions, more in the direction that we would like them to go. And the interesting thing about these questions is they don't have to answer them. They can say, there's a lot of great things about your territory. But if we sit down and say, well, just tell me like 3 or 4, well, could you tell me another one? Because I'm trying to get excited about this territory, like help, sell me on this territory. That might be a little bit aggressive, but the point is that often when we ask these questions, if the other person can't answer them, whether they say it's great or not, they've already convinced themselves. Because if they can't say anything good, then they already are starting to come around to our way of thinking. So I call it in the book, I call it questions that echo. And sometimes asking a question, as I say, actually, answers may change minds, but only questions change hearts. And so often we can ask questions of people that I had one where a CEO coach of mine asked me a question. He said, "Are you inspired by your life?" And okay, that's a yes, no question. I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, how inspired are you by your life? But in that case, he was actually specifically asking, are you inspired by your life? Because he knew that my answer was no in that moment. And that question echoed in my mind for like 3-4 years until I finally was at a point where I said, you know what? Yes, finally. And so this is how sometimes one question, children, employees, I've had many cases where we ask a question of someone and they may not change their behavior for 2, 3, 4 months, years, but that question still sits there waiting to be answered. And so I think that can be a powerful tool for change. And I think that one of the reasons why people enjoy the book is the way it's written is, many communication books kind of give you tools, and it's like, here's all these things to follow. One of the unique things we did in the book is we created a video book where I actually read it directly to camera, because there's something that's different. That if you close your eyes and you hear me like say these things, like if you're listening to an audiobook, it's very different to actually, if you're looking into my eyes, whether it's in your television or on your phone, you actually can feel what it's like to be asked these questions and be spoken to in this way, in a way that doesn't happen with an audiobook, and it definitely doesn't happen when you're reading a book. Because when we're reading a book, kind of like we're intellectually thinking about, how am I going to use this? Whereas the video book kind of makes a very different experience, and that's why we kind of pioneered the new format.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And I mean, I guess I know that in the respect that that's why I do LinkedIn Live, because there's difference between actually being present and being able to see a person when they're talking than doing a podcast.
Yes.
Which makes me also think about, I don't know if you know about the new app Clubhouse, where people are just doing audio. And it's funny because people, there's so many people on there that I wouldn't have necessarily connected with, but it's still not the same as having them come on my LinkedIn Live and having that face to face. So I think that's
even think like just the LinkedIn Live. If I've got my camera over here and I'm talking this way, like it's very different. Like, so, it's really that feeling of, oh, this is what it feels like to be spoken this way and spoken to this way. And so that's what we, the genesis for this idea was one of my most troubled relationships in my entire life since I was a teenager was with my father. And, about 2 years ago, I read the book to him. His eyesight's not great. And so he couldn't read the book. And I wanted him to, my deepest hope was that this book would actually transform my relationship with my father. And ultimately it was the act of reading him the book out loud. It took like 6 hours over the course of 2 or 3 afternoons. That was the turning point in our relationship. And so originally when I wrote the book, I was like, people aren't going to read the book out loud to one another. But we wanted to create something that families could use to transform their communication. So it's the first book. You can get it on Roku. You can get it on, Roku, Fire TV, the Apple TV app's going to be coming in about 2 weeks. So you actually pop it on your television, pop some popcorn, get the kids there. You can actually watch it together as a family. And then after each chapter, like, I'd like you to maybe practice that communication tool more with me. And what you'll find is your spouse or your children will say, they'll probably have different ones that they would like you to practice with them. So this really, it's a completely new format for, and I think for my purpose of using a book to transform communication in the context of families, it was really kind of, that's why we pioneered this new format. We call it Talk Shift TV.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll have to definitely check that out. But this is, our time's about up. And this has been a great conversation. I think there were a lot of actionable things that people can take away from it. I will definitely put the link in the comments to where you can get the book. So And I really appreciate you coming on. And I'm sorry about the challenges. I know Lydia's going to say, stop saying you're sorry. But, you know, I'm so glad you were able to get back on and share those thoughts with us because it was really great.
Talk shift number 22 is about saying sorry. So.
Oh, see, I need the book. Lydia always catches me on that. You said you're sorry. So coming up next week, I have Heidi Solomon Orlick, and we're going to be talking about changing the face of sales. And then March 24th, Ladies Happy Hour, which is finding your tribe. And then in April, I've got a panel discussion on artificial harmony. So if you feel like you're afraid to rock the boat at work, we're going to have a panel discussion with some actual takeaways, even for job seekers. So, Krister, thank you so much for joining me, and everybody who joined us live. Thank you. I appreciate you. So have a great week, everybody.
Bye-bye.